Beware of fraudulent copies of this and other media products. Genuine products are always wrapped in a seal and bear the Halakha Media mark. Fraudulent copies destroy future productions. Help us to help you. Buy a genuine product.
Open your mind. Halakha Media, the signature of quality and expression. Pioneering production. Trilling Dolby Pro Logic surround sound. Innovative, captivating. Compelling audio range. Open your mind. Open your mind. Open your mind. Visit www.halakha.com for more information. Signature of quality and expression.
In this torn land that is Palestine, tales are rife of an epoch of struggle between races and religions, tribes and nations, conquerors and conquered. In our era, Palestine denotes one of the most enduring and explosive of all the world's conflicts, a dilemma of two combustible claims to the same historical land. A land that lies between the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. One group claiming the land on religious grounds, the unfulfilled promise of God, and another on more simple reasons. This is where we live, this is where our forefathers lived, and this is our home. The claim is deeply rooted, complex, and agitated by external Western influences who have maliciously mismanaged the people of this ancient land for transitory solutions. Palestine has always been a land of great significances to three religions: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Three religions sharing similar prophets and all believing in the God of Abraham. It is one of the enigmas of humanity that despite having all this in common, there is always so much bloodshed, horror between these three groups in the Middle East. There is no truly unbiased look at the dilemma of modern-day Palestine. However, to believe that all is equal because both opposing sides have their claim only serves as a refuge for iniquity. We have seen apartheid in our lifetime, a system of institutionalized racism. We've also seen how long it took that system to abate. However, the legacies of that period in African history still linger in the ghettos of Soweto and Johannesburg. History repeats when we fail to address it. Palestine was once known as the land of Canaan, and apart from Africa is one of the oldest sites of agricultural activity in the world. The land has been settled for tens of thousands of years. Descendants of the Phoenicians of Tyre entered the area about 4,000 years ago. The Amorites and Canaanites have also settled the land in biblical times. The area presently occupied by Palestine and Israel consists of 10,000 square miles, all the way from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. 78% of the border of Israel and Palestine is shared in the east with Jordan. Palestine lies at the head of the Great Rift Valley, which extends all the way to Mozambique in southern Africa. During the long history of the area, a plethora of peoples have settled on the land. Such diversities have left the land torn and unsettled. From the archaeological records, the Jewish people are descendants of the once native Canaanite peoples and invading tribes. Sometime between 1800 and 1500 BC, a Semitic people called Hapiru left Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and settled in Canaan. The city of Jerusalem is noted as one of the oldest cities in the world, and according to some sources was founded by a priest-king called Melchizedek, who was a contemporary of Abraham. In the annals of Jewish scriptures, Jerusalem is referred to as foreign land. Jerusalem dates to around 1800 BC and was inhabited by a Canaanite subgroup called Jebusites. According to the Islamic and Christian teachings, Moses, in around 1270 BC, led the Israelites out of Egypt. Under Prophet Joshua, they conquered part of Palestine. The Israelites, a confederation of Hebrew tribes, finally defeated the Canaanites about 1125 BC, but the battle with the Philistines raged on. The Philistines were referred to as the people of the sea, and are believed to have originated from Illyria. They had established an independent state on the southern coast of Palestine, and exercised control over a number of towns to the north and east. Superior in military organization and armed with iron weapons, they demolished the Israelites about 1050 BC. The Philistine threat forced the Jewish factions to unite and establish a monarchy. Saul was proclaimed king of the Israelites in around 1030 BC, but was killed by the Philistine forces at the Battle of Gilboa. Prophet David, who served as a vassal, succeeded Saul as king and finally defeated the Philistines around 1000 BC and established a kingdom over much of Canaan, including parts of Transjordan. After the death in 922 BC of King David's son Suleiman, the Israelite tribes revolted, and the kingdom was divided into Judea in the south and Israel in the north. Jerusalem remained the center of Jewish sovereignty and of Jewish worship. The Assyrians conquered Israel in 722 BC, and the Babylonians conquered Judah in 586 BC. They destroyed Solomon's temple in Jerusalem and exiled a large number of Jews. The exiled Jews retained a great part of their cultural heritage, and it is during this period that a great portion of the Old Testament was written. "50 years later, the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylonia. Cyrus allowed a group of Jews from Babylonia to rebuild and settle in Jerusalem and Judea, a district within Palestine. However, a large number of Jews remained in Babylonia, forming the first Jewish diaspora. The Persians ruled the land from about 530 to 331 BC. Alexander the Great then conquered the Persian Empire, and after his death in 323 BC, his generals divided his empire. One of these generals, Seleucus, founded a dynasty that gained control of much of Palestine about 200 BC. Initially, the new rulers, called Seleucids, allowed the practice of Judaism, but later, King Antiochus IV tried to prohibit it and Hellenize the population. In 167 BC, the Jews revolted under the leadership of the Maccabeans and drove the Seleucids out of Palestine. The Roman general Pompey the Great in 61 BC invaded Judah and sacked Jerusalem. The area became a province of Rome called Judea, which was ruled by Jewish kings. Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem in the early years of Roman rule, during the reign of King Herod the Great. 2 Jewish revolts erupted and were suppressed. After the second one, numerous Jews were killed. Many were sold into slavery, and the rest were exiled from Palestine, forming a second Jewish diaspora. However, Jewish communities continued to exist in Galilee, the northernmost part of Palestine. In time, Christianity spread to most of Palestine. The population consisted of Jewish converts to Christianity, pagans, and other indigenous groups. Palestine received special attention when the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in AD 313. His mother, Saint Helena, visited Jerusalem. As a result, the area became a focus of Christian pilgrimage. A golden age of prosperity, security, and culture followed. Most of the population became Hellenized and Christianized. The Persians cast a covetous eye on Jerusalem, and in 614 Chosroes II, king of Persia, overran Syria and sent his armies to pillage Jerusalem. The invading army was joined by numerous Jews eager to exact revenge on the Christians, and thus destroyed many churches. Byzantine rule was reasserted in 627 by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. He restored the decree of Hadrian, which forbade Jews from entering the city of Jerusalem. In 638, when the great Muslim Arab armies moved north from Arabia to conquer most of the Middle East, Jerusalem was peacefully surrendered by Patriarch Sophronius to the Caliph Umar ibn Khattab after he assured the inhabitants protection. Caliph Umar erected a modest mosque at the spot where the Prophet Muhammad made his miraculous night journey. This mosque was later rebuilt by Caliph Abdul Malik in 691 and is called Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock was also near the site where King Suleiman's temple existed before it was destroyed in 586 BC. Between 705 and 724, the Umayyads built Al-Aqsa Mosque close by. The enclave is sacred to Muslims and is known as Haram al-Sharif. The Muslim rulers under Islamic or Sharia law allowed Christians and Jews to keep their religions. However, over a century, most of the local population gradually accepted Islam and the Arab Islamic culture of their rulers. The remaining Christians and Jews were considered people of the book. They were allowed autonomous control in their communities and guaranteed security and freedom of worship. Such tolerance was unique to Islam. Palestine prospered in the glory of Islamic civilization when the Muslim world enjoyed a golden age of science, art, philosophy, and literature. Muslims preserved Greek learning and made numerous artistic and scientific innovations, all of which later contributed to the Renaissance in Europe. In 750, Palestine became neglected when power shifted to Baghdad with the rule of the Abbasids. Like the rest of the empire, however, Palestine under the Mamelukes gradually stagnated and declined. The Seljuk Turks gained control of Jerusalem in 1071. Christian crusaders from Europe captured Jerusalem in 1099. A great slaughter of the Jewish and Muslim defenders followed, and in the aftermath no Jews were allowed to live in Jerusalem. The Crusaders held the city until 1187, when the great Muslim ruler Saladin attacked Palestine and retook control of Jerusalem. Beginning in the late 1300s, Jews from Spain and other Mediterranean lands settled in Jerusalem and other parts of the land. The Ottoman Empire defeated the Mamelukes in 1517, and Palestine became part of the Ottoman Empire. The Turkish Sultan invited Jews fleeing the Catholic Inquisition to settle in the Turkish Empire, including several cities in Palestine. In 1798, Napoleon entered the land. The war with Napoleon and subsequent misadministration by Egyptian and Ottoman rulers reduced the population of Palestine. Arabs and Jews fled to safer and more prosperous lands. Subsequent reorganization and the opening of the Turkish Empire to foreigners restored some order. They also allowed the beginnings of Jewish settlement under various Zionist and proto-Zionist movements. By 1880, about 24,000 Jews were living in Palestine, out of a population of about 400,000. Ottoman control in the 18th century was indirect. Dahir al-Umar dominated the political life of northern Palestine for nearly 40 years. Ahmad al-Jazar, the Ottoman governor of Acre, had control of most of Palestine, and in 1799, with English and Ottoman help, he successfully defended Acre against Napoleon. Both Dahir and al-Jazar led Palestine with a firm grip, during which time trade with Europe was growing. After the French withdrawal, Egypt, under Muhammad Ali, embarked upon a program of expansion at the expense of his Ottoman overlord. Under the Ottoman Turks, Palestine continued to be linked administratively to Damascus until 1830. Palestine was divided into the territories of Nablus and Acre, both linked with Beirut and Jerusalem, which dealt directly with Istanbul. In 1831, Muhammad Ali's armies occupied Palestine, and for 9 years he and his son gave it a centralizing and modernizing administration. Their rule opened the country to Western influences and therefore enabled Christian missionaries to establish many schools. Taxes were increased and urban rebellions broke out against the harshness of the regime. In 1840, when the British, Austrians and Russians came to the aid of the Ottomans, the Egyptians were forced to withdraw and Palestine reverted to the Ottoman Empire. After 1840, reforms by the Sultan gradually took effect in Palestine, increased security in the countryside, and the Land Law of 1858 encouraged the development of private property and agricultural production for the world market. The Ottomans extended the central government's new military, municipal, judicial and educational systems to Palestine. There was a marked increase in foreign settlements and colonies. The French, Russian and German Jews were the minorities, but they formed the Zionist agricultural settlements and were the forerunners of a Jewish national home and Jewish state. By 1880, there were about 24,000 Jews living in Palestine, out of a population of about 400,000. At about that time, the Ottoman government imposed severe restrictions on Jewish immigration and land purchase. These were evaded in various ways by Jews seeking to colonize Palestine. The rise of European nationalism in the 19th century, and mainly the intensification of anti-Semitism during the 1880s, encouraged European Jews to seek haven in their promised land, Palestine. Russian Jews established the earliest of these settlements in 1882. The writer and Zionist activist Theodor Herzl in 1896 issued a pamphlet, The Jewish State, and advocated an autonomous Jewish state in Palestine. He went to Palestine in 1898 to explore the possibilities and to seek the help of the German Emperor William II. In 1914, the total population of Palestine was about 700,000. About 615,000 were Arabs, and 85,000 to 100,000 were Jews. During World War I, 1914-18, the Ottoman Empire allied with Austria-Hungary against the Allies. At this time, Palestine was ruled by an Ottoman military government. The war brought great hardships to both Jewish and Arab populations, owing to outbreaks of cholera and typhus. The Turkish military governor ordered detention and deportation of all foreign nationals. A great number of Jews were foreign nationals. Due to concessions granted to Russia by the Ottoman Turks, Russian Jews had immigrated to Palestine. However, they also maintained Russian citizenship to avoid being drafted into the Turkish army. During the war, a large number of Jews fled Palestine. A small group founded the NILI, an underground network that fed intelligence about their Ottoman host to the British. In 1916, T.E. Lawrence led a revolt against the Ottomans, in the belief that Britain would help to establish Arab independence in the Middle East. After the defeat of the Ottoman Turks in 1918, the clandestine Sykes-Picot Agreement called for a part of Palestine to be under British rule, part to be placed under a condominium government, and for Syria and Lebanon to be given to France. Britain had conflictingly planned to back Arab demands for post-war independence from the Ottomans in return for Arab support. The Arabs claimed that Palestine was included in the area promised to them, but once the British had what they wanted, they conveniently denied this. In 1919, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration. The declaration stated that Britain supported the building of a national home in Palestine for the Jews, without violating the religious and civil rights of non-Jewish people. In 1922, the British declared that the boundary of Palestine would be limited to the areas west of the river. The area east of the river, now called Jordan, was made a separate British mandate. The British hoped to establish self-governing institutions in Palestine, but the Arabs would not accept any proposals for such institutions if they included Jewish autonomy, and therefore no institutions were created. The Arabs naturally opposed the idea of a Jewish national home, as Palestine was their native land. They did not entertain the idea of living under the rule of a minority immigrant Jewish population. Arabs lobbied in favor of annexing mandated areas of Palestine to Syria, and later formed a national movement to combat the Zionists. By this time, the Zionists had recognized that conflict with the Palestine Arabs was inevitable. No solution was in sight, as the Arabs and the Jews both wanted Palestine as their own. In 1920, 1921 and 1929, riots were instigated by Arabs out of fear of Jewish domination in Jerusalem, Hebron, Jaffa and Haifa. This led to evacuation of Jews from Hebron. Half the Jewish population of Jerusalem also fled. This uprising led to the formation of the Haganah, a Jewish self-defense organization. During World War II, 1939 to 1945, Palestinian Arabs and Jews joined the Allied forces against Germany. Nazis allegedly murdered 6 million people from a multitude of ethnic and religious backgrounds during the war. Among the targeted were Jews who had not left Germany. After the war, the Jews in Palestine were anxious to bring the remaining Jews to what they saw as their promised land. Attempts were made to bring them in illegally by the Haganah. Zionist underground groups used terrorist tactics to drive the British out of Palestine. The United States of America and other countries also placed pressure on Britain to allow immigration, while the Arabs placed pressure on the British to impede it. Exhausted by 7 years of war, and eager to withdraw from overseas colonial commitments, Great Britain in 1947 decided to leave Palestine and called on the United Nations to make recommendations. In response, the United Nations convened its first special session in 1947. It adopted a plan calling for partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem as an international zone under United Nations jurisdiction. The Jewish and Arab states would be joined in an economic union. The partition resolution was endorsed by a vote of 33 to 13, supported by the United States and the Soviet Union. The British abstained from the vote. The Jews accepted the United Nations decision, but the Arabs rejected it. The resolution divided the land into 2 portions with zigzag borders. At the time of the partition, slightly less than half the land in Palestine was owned by the Arabs. Slightly less than half was crown lands, owned by the state, and about 8% was owned by Jews. There were about 6,000 Jews in Palestine, almost all living in the Jewish allotted area, and about 1.2 million Arabs. The large Jewish population were geographically cut off from the rest of the Jewish state, and it became evident that the UN scheme could not work. In Palestine, Arab protests erupted in violence with attacks on Jewish settlements in retaliation for the attacks of Jewish terrorist groups on Arab towns and villages. Hundreds of unarmed Palestinians were massacred in their homes. The British refused to intervene, intent on leaving the country no later than August the 15th, 1948. When it became clear that the British intended to leave, leaders of the Yishuf decided to implement part of the partition plan, calling for establishment of a Jewish state. In Tel Aviv on May the 14th, the Provisional State Council, representing the Jewish people in Palestine and the World Zionist Movement, proclaimed the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine, to be called Medinat Israel, or the State of Israel. This state was open to the immigration of Jews from all the countries of their dispersion. On May 15th, the armies of Egypt, Transjordan, present-day Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq joined Palestinian and other Arab guerrillas who had been fighting Jewish forces since November 1947. The war now became an international conflict, the first Arab-Israeli war. The Arabs failed to prevent establishment of a Jewish state, and the war ended with 4 UN-arranged armistice agreements between Israel and Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. The United Nations resolutions called for cessation of hostilities, the return of refugees who wished to live in peace. However, Israel refused to readmit more than a small number of refugees. The USSR aligned itself with the Arab countries. The United States continued to support Israel. The Arab League instituted an economic boycott against Israel that was partly honored by most industrial nations and which lasted into the 1990s. The population balance in the new state of Israel was drastically altered during the 1948 war. The armistice agreements extended the territory under Israel's control beyond the United Nations partition boundaries. Attempts to convert the Israeli-Arab armistice agreements into peace treaties were unsuccessful. The Arabs insisted that 630,000 refugees in neighboring Arab countries be permitted to return to their homes. They also appealed that Jerusalem be internationalized and that Israel make territorial concessions before they entered peace talks. Israel charged that these demands would undermine its security and refused them. Frequent incursions by refugee guerrilla bands and attacks by Arab military units were made, which Israel answered with forceful retaliation. The small Gaza Strip on the Egypt-Israel border was left under Egyptian control, and Jordan controlled the West Bank. Israel's Provisional State Council organized elections for the first Knesset, or parliament, in 1949. Chaim Weizmann, the most prominent Zionist leader of the pre-war period, became the country's first president. NASA, in a bid to gain funds which were bitterly denied by the IMF, nationalized the Suez Canal. Then, in 1956, the British and the French backed the Israelis in an invasion of the Sinai Peninsula and closed the Suez Canal. As a result, the Second Arab-Israeli War in October and November of 1956 took place. Great Britain and France ostensibly joined the attack because of their dispute with Nasser. Israel scored a quick victory, seizing the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula within a few days. As Israeli forces reached the banks of the Suez Canal, the British and French started their attack. The United Nations halted the fighting after a few days, and a United Nations emergency force was sent to supervise the ceasefire in the canal zone. In a rare instance of cooperation, the United States and the Soviet Union supported the United Nations resolution, forcing the three invading countries to leave Egypt and Gaza. By the end of the year, their forces withdrew from Egypt, but Israel refused to leave Gaza until early in 1957, and only after the United States had promised to help resolve the conflict and keep the Straits of Tiran open. In 1967, tension developed between Israel and Syria because of Syrian attempts to divert waters of the Jordan for irrigation projects. The Straits of Tiran were again closed in 1967 to Israeli shipping and dismissed the United Nations Peace Force from the Sinai Peninsula. Israel attacked the Egyptians. Syria and Jordan began shelling Israeli territory. By the time the United Nations ceasefire ended the 1967 war on June the 11th, Israel had occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, and Syria's Golan Heights. The United Nations resolution again called for negotiations for permanent peace between the parties, and for Israel to withdraw from land occupied in 1967. After the Suez-Sinai War, Arab nationalism increased dramatically, as did demands for revenge, led by Egypt's President Nasser. The formation of a united Arab military command that massed troops along the borders, together with Egypt's closing of the Straits of Tiran, and Nasser's insistence in 1967 that UNEF leave Egypt, led Israel to attack Jordan and Syria simultaneously. On June the 5th, a massive preemptive strike crippled the Arabs' air capacity. Israeli forces then quickly moved to occupy the Gaza Strip and push into the Sinai. Israel's French-equipped air force wiped out the air power of its adversaries and was the chief instrument in their success. The Six-Day War left Israel in possession of Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, which it took from Egypt, Arab East Jerusalem and the West Bank, which it took from Jordan, and the coveted Golan Heights, taken from Syria. Land under Israel's jurisdiction after the 1967 war was about 4 times the size of the area within its 1949 armistice frontiers. The occupied territories became a major political issue in Israel after 1967. The right wing and leaders of the country's Orthodox religious parties opposed withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza, which they considered part of Israel. The majority of Israelis, however, supported the annexation of East Jerusalem and its unification with the Jewish sectors of the city. Following the 1967 war, there was an upsurge of Palestinian Arab nationalism. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Fatah organization, which evolved into the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, gained an all-Arab recognition as the representative of the Palestinian people in 1968. Guerrilla attacks on Israeli targets at home and abroad unified public opinion against recognition of and negotiation with the PLO. However, the PLO was gaining widespread international support, including United Nations recognition, as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. In 1973, Egypt joined Syria in a war on Israel to recover the territories lost in the 1967 Six-Day War. On October 6, the two Arab states struck unexpectedly on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. After crossing the Suez Canal, the Arab forces advanced rapidly into the Sinai Peninsula and Golan Heights. Israeli forces, with a colossal United States economic and military assistance, succeeded in stopping the Arab forces after a 3-week struggle. Israel's defensive victory came at the tremendous cost of many casualties, and the Arabs' strong showing won them support from the Soviet Union and most of the world's developing countries. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait had financed the Arab forces, making it possible for Egypt and Syria to receive sophisticated Soviet weapons. The Arab petroleum-producing world, in retaliation for America's overwhelming support of Israel, cut off petroleum exports to the United States and other Western nations. Israel, forced to compete with the nearly unlimited Arab resources, was faced with a serious financial setback. Only massive United States economic and military assistance enabled it to redress the balance, but even American aid was unable to prevent a downward spiral of the economy. In an effort to encourage a peace settlement, United States President Nixon assigned his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, the task of negotiating agreements between Israel, Egypt, and Syria. During 1974, Kissinger managed to work out military disengagements between Israel and Egypt in the Sinai and between Israel and Syria in the Golan Heights. Menachem Begin was the first Israeli leader to achieve a peace settlement with an Arab state. It resulted from the surprise initiative of President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, who in November 1977 flew to Jerusalem, where he addressed the Knesset, and called on Begin to begin peace talks. After protracted negotiations, espoused by United States President Jimmy Carter at Camp David, Maryland, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty was signed in Washington, D.C. on March 26, 1979. Although the treaty ended the prospects for war between Israel and Egypt, many issues remained between the two countries, including the problem of arranging for Arab autonomy in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. The two sides were unable to make considerable progress on the broader Arab-Israeli peace issue. Most of the Arab world reacted negatively to the accords of the treaty. The Arab League ousted Egypt and moved its headquarters from Cairo to Tunis. Other Arab states broke off relations with Egypt. In Israel, the decision proved very unpopular with the right wing. On October 6, 1981, a gunman in Cairo murdered the 62-year-old President Mohammed Anwar el-Sadat of Egypt. The shooting happened at 1 p.m. during the annual military parade to commemorate the beginning of the Egyptian attack in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. A lorry in the procession stopped in front of the rostrum, where the president and other luminaries were watching a flypast of Egyptian Air Force jets. Armed men climbed out and ran towards Sadat, hurling grenades and opening fire with automatic weapons. The president and 7 others fell, mortally wounded. Sadat was flown to Mahdi Military Hospital, where he died an hour and 40 minutes later. Sadat's funeral on October 10th was attended by only one Arab head of state. His rapprochement with Israel had won him and Begin the Nobel Peace Prize in 1978, but ostracized him from his Arab neighbors. Iraq, Libya, Syria, and the PLO overtly commended his assassination. In Damascus, a chorus of chants proclaimed, "The traitor is dead." In 1982, Israel launched an invasion into Lebanon, intended at wiping out the PLO presence there. By mid-August, after intensive fighting in and around Beirut, the PLO agreed to withdraw its guerrillas from the city. Israeli troops remained in southern Lebanon. However, the cost of the war and subsequent occupation drained the already troubled Israeli economy. In further attempts to destroy guerrilla bases, Israeli jets had bombed Muslim West Beirut, despite appeals for restraint from the United States government. Ethiopia in 1985 forced the Israeli government to stop its covert airlift of falashas, Ethiopian Jews, to Israel. Since beginning the airlift in 1974, when persecution of the falashas increased after the Derg ousted Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, Israel had airlifted some 12,000 members of the ancient Jewish sect. The falashas had existed in isolation from the rest of the Jewish world since about the 2nd century BC. Israel resumed the airlift in 1989, and within a few years most of the approximately 14,000 remaining falashas had emigrated. These black Jews were met with contempt in Israel and were assigned to subservient blue-collar and military designations. The irony is that most of the racism came from European Jews, who, unlike the Ethiopians, are from a religious and hereditary perspective far removed from the original biblical Jews mentioned in the Quran and the Bible. The Intifada was born out of a Palestinian reaction to the Zionist settlements, which remained unabated. It began in the Gaza Strip in December 1987 with civil disobedience and rapidly spread across the occupied territories. The Intifada campaign consisted of demonstrations, strikes, riots and violence directed against the rule of Israel in Gaza and the West Bank. Israel responded to this uprising of civilians by rifle fire, anti-tank missiles, closure of universities, deportations, economic sanctions, and aggressive taxation, and by an increased program of Israeli settlement in the occupied territories. The Israeli army deliberately targeted the heads and legs of unarmed Palestinian civilians. 40% of Palestinians wounded by the Israeli soldiers were under 18 years of age. Palestinians and many around the world insisted that Israeli policy and actions constituted a serious breach of the Convention on Human Rights and a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention. As the Intifada continued, however, many Israelis were persuaded that it would be better to seek a political solution, which would relieve them of direct responsibility, at least for Gaza. On the 14th of April 1988, Abu Jihad, a Palestinian leader, was gunned down in his home in Tunis by Israel's version of the CIA, Mossad. Then, on the 15th of November of the same year, the Palestinian National Council met in Algiers and declared the State of Palestine as outlined in the United Nations Partition Plan 181. Mainly Israel's hostile neighbors recognized the new state. The UN General Assembly held a special session on the question of Palestine in Geneva. On the 20th of May 1990, an Israeli gunman near Tel Aviv massacred 7 Palestinian workers from Gaza. Yasser Arafat addressed the United Nations Security Council in Geneva after the massacre, in which he called for the deployment of a United Nations emergency force to provide international protection for the Palestinian people, to safeguard their lives, properties, and holy places. The United States vetoed a motion which called for the Security Council to send a fact-finding mission to the area. The Arab summit in Baghdad pledged support for the Palestinian Intifada and strongly denounced the settlement of Soviet Jews within the occupied territories. On the 26th of June 1990, the European Economic Community in Dublin issued a new declaration on the Middle East, which condemned Israeli human rights violations and the settlement of Soviet Jews in the occupied territories. It also doubled its economic aid program to the occupied territories. Events in the Middle East took a surprising turn in 1993. After secret negotiations, Prime Minister Rabin and PLO chairman Yasser Arafat flew to Washington, D.C. and agreed to sign a historic peace agreement. Israel agreed to allow Palestinian self-rule, first in the Gaza Strip, then the West Bank town of Jericho, and later in other non-settled areas of the West Bank. In September 1993, at a ceremony in Washington, D.C., representatives of Israel and the PLO signed an agreement designed to end 45 years of confrontation between the Israelis and Palestinians. The actual signing was done by Israel's Foreign Minister Shimon Peres and PLO foreign policy spokesman Mahmoud Abbas. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin of Israel and Yasser Arafat met and shook hands on the White House lawn, as the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, and 3,000 guests looked on. The agreement was limited in scope. It provided for transfer of the Gaza Strip and Jericho to Palestinian rule within a few months. However, the accord was regarded as a first step in resolving years of violent conflict between Jews and Palestinians. Away from the world's view, they structured the tenets of agreement in Oslo, Norway. Following this signing, a long process of negotiation began on the means of transferring power to the occupied lands. In May 1994, at a ceremony in Cairo, Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin signed the final version of the Declaration of Principles, initiated in Washington, D.C. The accord was regarded as a start towards bringing peace between Israelis and Palestinians after 45 years of conflict. Within 24 hours of signing, Israeli military forces were scheduled to leave the Gaza Strip and Jericho, ending 27 years of occupation. In spite of the accord, Jewish and Palestinian extremists in Israel vowed to prevent its full implementation. In July 1994, Prime Minister Rabin and King Hussein of Jordan signed a peace agreement, ending 46 years of war and strained relations. The agreement, which was signed at the White House in the presence of United States President Bill Clinton, laid the groundwork for a full peace treaty. On September 24, 1995, Israeli and PLO officials met in Taba, Egypt, to finalize the agreement on the second stage of eventual Israeli withdrawal from Palestinian lands. Under the pact, which was officially signed on September 28, 1995, in Washington, D.C., Israeli forces were scheduled to be removed from 6 Arab cities and 400 villages in the West Bank by early 1996. Elections were then held for an 82-member Palestinian Council, which possessed legislative and executive power in the West Bank and Gaza. On November 4, 1995, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in Tel Aviv by a Jewish right-wing extremist who considered Rabin's crusade for peace a betrayal of the Jewish state. The Prime Minister was shot 3 times as he was getting into his car. He was pronounced dead at 11:10 p.m. Yigal Amir, his assassinator, is said to have been influenced by right-wing settlers and rabbis who denounced Rabin's support for the impending transfer of land to the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres then took over leadership of the Labour government. Peres, an advocate of peace, was defeated by Likud party leader Benjamin Netanyahu, initiating a period of frosty relations between Israelis and Palestinians. In 1999, Labour candidate Ehud Barak won a landslide victory over Prime Minister Netanyahu. The election of Barak, a former chief of staff in the Israeli Defense Forces, was heralded as a one-of-a-kind opportunity for peace. It was widely believed that only Barak, with his strong military credentials, could broker an agreement that would hold up to scrutiny. Barak once claimed he so understood the Palestinians' dilemma that if he had been one of them, he might have joined a terrorist organization. But Barak became more tight-lipped on such matters, refusing to be pinned down on almost any of the controversial issues, except to offer vague mantras that Jerusalem would remain united and that the Palestinians must determine their own future. Ehud Barak's government's initial optimism about the peacemaking prospects proved tenuous. A new accord was signed in September 1999, but further withdrawals from occupied land were hindered by disagreements and the final status talks on Jerusalem, refugees, settlements and borders. Frustration was sweltering in the Palestinian population, who had little to show for a stagnant 5 years of the peace debates. Barak concentrated on peace with Syria, but this was also unsuccessful. However, he did succeed in fulfilling a campaign pledge to end Israel's 21-year entanglement in Lebanon. After the withdrawal from Lebanon in May 2000, attention turned back to Yasser Arafat, who was under pressure from Barak and the United States President Bill Clinton to abandon gradual negotiations and launch an all-out push for a final settlement at the presidential retreat at Camp David. Two weeks of talks failed to come up with acceptable solutions to the status of Jerusalem and the right of return of Palestinian refugees. Arafat insisted on Palestinian sovereignty over East Jerusalem. In response, Barak, in rebuff, took back his offer to allow Palestinian control of Muslim and Christian quarters of the old walled city. Arafat's stance earned him favor throughout the Arab world. At the same time, many Israelis were shocked that Arafat would walk away from a deal far more generous than ever before offered by an Israeli leader. In the uncertainty of the ensuing impasse, Ariel Sharon, the veteran right-winger, widely known as a war criminal and reviled by non-Jews, succeeded Benjamin Netanyahu as Likud leader. Sharon then maliciously toured the Al-Aqsa Mount complex in Jerusalem on the 28th of September. Sharon's critics saw it as a highly provocative move. His visit sparked spiraling violence by Palestinians, frustrated by the failure of peace talks to fulfill their aspirations or end Israeli repression. The fury of this new intifada frustrated the Israeli population and soured them on the prospect of negotiated peace. Palestinian demonstrations followed, quickly developing into what has become known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. By the end of 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak found himself reigning over an increasingly bitter and bloody cycle of violence as the Intifada raged on against Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Unable to either quell the violence or make progress in negotiations, and facing a government on the edge of dissolution, Barak resigned and called a special election on February 6, 2001. Yasser Arafat resisted pressure to reach a pre-election peace deal and help keep a peace-minded Israeli government in power. A final settlement did not take place as negotiations broke down in 2000. Palestinians wanted refugees to be allowed to return to Israel. Israel wanted to annex key portions of the Palestinian areas, leaving Palestine a limited form of statehood. An Israeli electorate that had overwhelmingly turned its back on the land for peace formulas of the 1990s and now favoured a tougher approach to Israel's Palestinian problem, swept Ariel Sharon on February the 6th to power. Peace was shadowed by a dark cloud. The death toll soared as Sharon intensified existing policies, such as assassinating Palestinian militants, airstrikes, and incursions into Palestinian self-ruled areas. Palestinian militants stepped up suicide bomb attacks in Israeli cities in desperation against Sharon's relentless crusade. The United States spearheaded international efforts to calm the violence. Envoy George Mitchell led an inquiry into the uprising, while CIA Director George Tenet negotiated a ceasefire, but neither initiative broke the cycle of bloodshed. Sharon lives up to his profile, and the level of violence in the Middle East escalates. Tit-for-tat exchanges pair Palestinian suicide bombings with Israeli military actions. As a result, the Palestinian Intifada moves from the fringes of Palestinian public opinion to the mainstream. The September the 11th attack on the United States escalated the problems in the Middle East. American agitators began to link Palestinian organizations with Osama bin Laden. Israel quickly echoed United States rhetoric, the war on terror, to describe its struggle with Palestinian militants. The USA, in the world spotlight, takes a superficial and simplified renewed interest in trying to establish stability in the Middle East. Bush, however, in reality seems more eager to find a new war than negotiate peace deals, as his predecessors did. Palestinian leaders begin to quickly distance themselves from the attacks, with Yasser Arafat cracking down on those who publicly expressed support for them. A spate of suicide bombings in Israel and the resultant international and Israeli pressure to act against those responsible puts Yasser Arafat in a difficult position. Unprecedented bids for peace were trumped by unprecedented violence. Yasser Arafat, newly emboldened to leverage Palestinian demands, won Israeli concessions and worldwide sympathy. However, his failure to stifle the growing tide of Palestinian suicide bombing attacks against Israeli civilian targets helped doom the efforts of U.S. mediator Anthony Zinni to win a ceasefire. Arab leaders meeting in Beirut raised hopes for peace by pledging normal ties in return for, among other things, a return to Israel's pre-1967 borders. But Israel deems the plan vague and threatening to its security and identity. As winter turns to spring, only the rhetoric seemed to be heating up as a fusillade of suicide attacks brought the region to the brink of all-out war. March 2002 saw a resolution being passed calling on all sides to stop the violence, which also called for the formation of a Palestinian state to be formed alongside Israel. Increasingly, the Palestinian fighters for national liberation against Zionist colonialism are employing more sophisticated methods of resistance, attacking Israeli soldiers and Zionist settlements. They're taking their fight to the enemy's camp. The world is beginning to see the horns on the nation that is Israel. Their single-minded arrogance has reflected poorly on a people who used to epitomize the victim, for they now stand in the shoes of Nazis, Stalin, apartheid. As a Zionist prejudice casts an evil shadow over a neo-colonized people, The once oppressed now are the greatest oppressors. Israel is a nation wielding nuclear weapons of mass destruction. With its segregationalist laws and excessive use of force, it hardly seems qualified to be trusted with such destructive apparatus. The cycle of violence can only be broken when Israel acknowledges its illegitimate claim is only as valid as the claim of South African whites on black land. Israel must be made to understand that the more inhumane force she applies, the more brutally creative the Palestinians will have to become in their resistance against Israeli hegemony. Some say it is for both parties to take steps to peace, and this is true, but it is not a war of equals. For one side has fighter jets, helicopters and nuclear weapons. It is then for the stronger, more secure side to set the road for peace. But this peace must mean justice, and justice means respecting the basic human rights of the Palestinian people. Israel's first gesture of sincere peace must be to stop bulldozing down the homes of everyday Palestinians, to make way for European Jews. They must stop terrorizing families, and they must stop implementing discriminating draconian laws. The renewed violence, or the reactionary violence, when manifested in suicide bombings, should be viewed as a gauge of the level of oppression that these people are subjected to. One thing that the Palestinians must be mindful of is not ever to take on the traits of their oppressors, as many Israelis have done. They must also be realistic in their plans for Israel. Israel will always put the needs of their people first, and will not simply hand over the keys to Palestine. The tide of fortune and history has begun to flow in favor of the Palestinian people. The world's eyes have widened and empathized with their plight. If the Palestinians continue to show steadfastness, perseverance and determination, and if members within the Jewish community express disdain at the inequality within their legislation, then the possibility is that the tide will change. The role of the citizen of every nation is clear when inequality raises its ugly head. The chorus of voices must echo discontent. Marches, letters, boycotts, faxes, emails, pressure must be placed on governments to break ties with countries that oppress and exploit. If change is to come, it must come first from the individual citizen of the world. The quest for freedom and self-determination is a flame inside us all, from Africans around the globe to Asians in the subcontinent, and it is this flame that burns strong within the Palestinian. As long as someone denies another human being their basic human rights, the path to war will always stay illuminated, and lands will always remain torn. Coming soon from Halakha Media, African Kingdoms. Come with us as we explore the majesty, the heritage, and the power that is African Kingdoms. Told in 3 60-minute specially enhanced CDs, spanning the length and breadth of the vast African continent. African Kingdoms takes us on an unforgettable journey of discovery and wonder. Learn about the marvels of Mansa Musa, the enduring magnificence of the pharaohs, the splendor of Abyssinia as we lift the age-long veil of distortions and misconception surrounding this great continent.